Hey vinyl community, welcome back to a brand new episode of RB's Vinyl Corner. We're on a roll here because the last couple of videos I've been talking about Shakin Stevens. And given the reactions, the enthusiastic reactions of fellow Shakin Stevens fans on my videos, I decided to continue this. Now, we're kind of like building a community here. I feel together with my fellow YouTubers and fellow Shakin Stevens fans that's also posting Shakin Stevens stuff on YouTube. We're really building something here, and I hope we can expand on this. So sharing our passion, sharing our ideas, sharing our opinions, which can differ very much from time to time, and also learn from each other, because sometimes I come up with something and then one of you guys come up with a reaction and give me complete history lessons that blow me away. So it's really awesome to learn from you and to have some new insights in that stuff, because the truth is there is not a lot of information available, at least not to me, about recording sessions of these albums and about the history surrounding those albums. And I'm always really interested in learning some of that stuff. So the last couple of videos I talked about this wonderful box set, the Fire in the Blood, which is an amazing release. And inspired by the release of that set, I decided to come up with picking some of the albums that contain in that set and talk about them a little bit more in depth. Now, I talked about some of my favorite albums. I did a video on my #1 Shakin Stevens album, which is Shaky. I talked about the follow-up on that album, which is Give Me Your Heart Tonight. Now, for today's video, I decided to turn it around, and instead of talking about one of my favorite albums, I came up with the idea to talk about my least favorite Shakin Stevens albums. And I'm also at the same time really interested in what your least favorite Shakin Stevens album is. And that does not mean that it should be a bad album, but it's the one that, well, if you have to pick a top 3 to take with you to a island for a year, which one will you not choose? So there you go. Now for today's video, my least favorite Shakin Stevens albums, and I'm sorry to say, but absolutely that would be Lipstick, Powder and Paint. And I'm gonna actually discuss 2 albums. So these are the 2 that are on the bottom of my list, and the other one is Let's Boogie. Now, let's talk about Let's Boogie first. Now, before we're gonna continue, when I say my least favorite albums, that does not mean that these are bad albums. It's just that those are the ones that will not be my favorites for different reasons. And but even the worst album of an artist will always have some great songs on it. There will always be a standout song or a hidden gem or whatever. Like I always like to compare it with Elvis Presley. For example, take this album. We have Elvis Paradise Hawaiian Style, one of his soundtracks. Now we all know that in the whole history of his recording history, the soundtracks are not the favorites of many of the fans. The quality is really discussable, and they became worse and worse. And this is absolutely not a great album, all right? But still, although it's not a great album, it has at least two fantastic songs, which is This Is My Heaven, which is a beautiful song, and it has a wonderful, absolutely fantastic ballad called Sandcastles. So even the worst Elvis Presley album has great songs on it. And that will always be the case for each and every artist around there, for every musician. Now, if we're going to talk about this album, first of all, I don't really consider this an album, although it is released as such, all right? It was a direct follow-up to Lipstick, Powder and Paint, and it was released prior to a whole lot of Shaky. Now, this album, in my opinion, is more a AP or a mini album than a full album, because actually there are only 5 songs on this one, 5 new tracks that make up this album, and that they make up the complete A-side. Now, in this album, in this time, sometimes I feel, and correct me if I'm wrong, or maybe you think differently about it, but it sometimes feels like Shaky got a kind of got lost in his in which direction he wanted to go, because for years he had been making rock and roll music, but this album he really is walking in different avenues. For example, the opening track is "Come See About Me," obviously is Motown. Now, is it bad? No, it's a complete different direction, and I don't think a lot of fans liked it in the first place. It's completely different, and I wonder what he really. Again, I understand that as an artist, sometimes you want to try out new avenues, and let's face it. By the time this album came out in 1987, Shakin' Stevens was already like for almost 20 years doing rock and roll. So I can understand after 20. I mean, even Elvis Presley didn't make it to 20 years of only rock and roll. It was just in the first couple of years where he was really rock and rolling, and then he started walking different avenues. And I can understand Shaky tried the same thing. But like, you know, it's because after this he would return a little bit. There's not a lot of guitar stuff on this. It's not like the Mickey G guitar solos that would make up albums like Mary Marie or Shaky or even Give Me Your Heart Tonight. He already started experimenting a little bit with different directions on his the Bop Won't Stop album. I mean, Cry Just a Little Bit obviously is a kind of like a different direction, and Breaking Up My Heart was like a complete disco track. It was completely different than all the other stuff, and he's continuing that also on this album with a little boogie woogie in the back of my mind. Now, a little boogie woogie in the back of my mind. I was just recently watching some videos on YouTube, and I went through that clip again, and then to some of his TV performances, and I went like, it didn't really work for me with all the dancers and all that stuff he was coming up with, and I think he was trying to become part of a disco generation, but Shaky Stevens is not a disco artist. He is a rock and roll artist, and he should stick with that. And so I personally don't think it really worked out very well for him. I liked the ballad Because I Love You, though. It's a great song, and it's a great ballad. But again, I really feel this is more like a mini album or a glorified AP or single than an album, and where he was actually trying some different things. Now, the B-side of this album is actually really interesting, because at the time when this came out, there were no live albums available of Shaky Stevens, but the whole B-side is actually part of a live concert. Now, by the time he was promoting his album Lipstick, Powder and Pain, he was doing a lot of the new songs to promote the album, of course, but the fans also, you know, they wanted to hear all the classics, all the big hits. So what he did is he came up with a huge medley that he called The Hits Keep Coming, and in that medley, like almost 25 minutes, all the hits would pass. The whole Greatest Hits album would pass in a very long medley, and it was actually pretty cool. And what they did is they took that whole medley and put it on the B-side of this, and that's actually, to be very honest, pretty cool. I love that medley, live medley, way more than the medley they released later on. So that is what makes the B-side, and that's actually the highlight for me personally of this album. But I don't really consider it the album, and therefore it's completely at the bottom of my list of Shaky Stevens albums. Now let's continue with Lipstick, Powder and Paint. Now I just realized, picking up my copy of this album, that it has water damage, and I have no idea how it got there. So I need to replace this copy, and I will do that soon. Fortunately, this is an album that's quite easy to get. A lot of people are selling this. So, but again, Lipstick, Powder and Pain. Now, Lipstick, Powder and Pain, it's also not one of my favorite albums, but still it has some great songs on it. We will get there a little bit later on. But it is of historical significance also, because talking about this album, it means that we also have to talk about another album. And that other album is actually a legend that was released in 1970. Now, this is not the original sleeve for Legend. This is actually a later reissue. We will get there in a moment. But there is a common denominator on those albums, and you can probably already guess what that is. Exactly. They are both produced by the great Dave Edmunds. So, before we're going to talk about my least favorite Shaky Stevens album, let's discuss a fantastic album. So this is the debut album of Shaky Stevens and the Sunsets. Now again, like I told you, this is not the original sleeve. As you can see here, someone is wearing a Shaky Stevens shirt, and this is very clearly the early 80s logo of Shaky Stevens. So the picture you see here must have been taken somewhere in the early 80s. Now this is a re-release, and I'm not really sure, I did not do my homework properly, but I think this was released, maybe re-released somewhere in 1981 or maybe even 1982. That was the height of Shakin' Stevens' career, and he was really popular, delivering one hit after another. And this is where a lot of the budget labels started to cash in on his popularity by re-releasing a lot of his Sunsets material. So in the first half of the 80s, there are a lot of Shakin' Stevens and the Sunsets albums released from one budget label to another budget label and another budget label. And so also this very first Shakin' Stevens album, they put a different sleeve because obviously they wanted to put a more recent picture of Shakin' Stevens, and they just forget about the whole Sunsets band. But on the original sleeves for these albums, you actually see the whole band. But I don't have a copy of the original version of this one. And that's actually one that's pretty high on my want list. I really want an original copy of A Legend. And I'm absolutely sure I will get one day. They are pretty expensive. They are really hard to find. And if you find one, then the prices are pretty high. But when you get close to a completion of a collection, one wants to spend a little bit more money on actually completing it. So it will eventually find its way to my collection. But for now, let's discuss it with this one. Now, like I told you before, the common denominator of these two albums is that they are both produced by Dave Edmunds. So Dave Edmunds actually had the honor to produce the very first Shakin' Stevens album, and he did an amazing job, because this album, recorded in 1970, is really authentic. It really has a very authentic feel for the 50s materials they are representing here. Because each and every song on this album, I will show you them here, the whole track list, are covers from songs that have been previously released in the 50s by different artists. And those are not Elvis Presley, not Roy Orbison, not Eddie Cochran, but they pick out songs from more obscure artists. And that's what I really love about this. And the last couple of days, I've been looking up the original versions of these songs on Spotify. And I found all of them. And I actually created a playlist on Spotify in the order of a Legend album by all the original artists. Now, if you are interested in that, I will put a link beneath this video so you can go there and listen to this whole album, but then the versions of the originals. And that's, I can tell you, it's a fun listen, because actually it inspires me to go out and try to find some of the original rock and roll albums by those artists that I actually never listened to before, because I am one of those guys that have been listening to a lot of the more commercial known musicians. Fats Domino, Eddie Cochran, Buddy Holly, Roy Orbison, Elvis Presley, that kind of stuff. But not the stuff that they were covering, and it's pretty cool, I can tell you. So, Cast Iron Arm was actually co-written by Roy Orbison, but I don't recall that he ever recorded a version of his own. Great songs on this album. There are 16 tracks. Now, When Dave Edmunds was producing this album, one of the band members of Shaky Stevens and the Sunset was this guy called Rocking Louie. And his real name was Robert Llewellyn. I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly. But that guy had already been around for a long time, fronting his own band called the Backbeats. And Shaky Stevens was actually, as a kid, he went to a lot of those gigs and he was really inspired by that band. And the story goes that he actually went to this Rockin' Louie guy to ask for tips and like on singing and advice on dancing and all that kind of stuff. And eventually, when the Backbeats ceased to exist, they somehow got together and winded up in each other's band, which was called Shaky Stevens and the Sunsets. And then this is where Shaky Stevens would fronted the band. And he was regularly called the Rockin' Louie 2. Now, I'm not sure if it's a true story, but that's what I read and heard. Now, when Dave Edmunds was actually producing this album, he insisted that Rockin' Louie would also take vocals on a couple of songs. And probably this was not really appreciated by Shaky Stevens, but in the end, they agreed. And so he is actually singing lead vocals on 3 of the songs of this album. Now, one of those 3 songs is I Hear You Knocking. It is sung by Rockin' Louie. And here it goes. When Dave Edmunds was actually producing this song, it inspired him to record his own version of I Hear You Knocking. And as you probably already know, it became the biggest hits single of Dave Edmunds till date. So, and he was inspired by the version of the Sunsets. So that's actually a pretty cool story. And then years later, fast forward to 2005, Shaky Stevens recorded his own version that was based not on the original, but was based on Dave Edmunds' version of I Hear You Knocking. And you can hear that version on the album Now Listen. So that's actually pretty cool. And just to think about the history of only that song. And it all started with A Legend. It's a great album, guys. There is a great rock and roll track. I love Lonesome Train. I love Lights Out. Really, really rocking song. I like I'll Try from Conway Twitty. I like Please Mr. Major, where the singer is actually begging the major to not ban rock and roll music because it's actually, you know, good for his soul. And we all know that in the 50s, how, you know, people tried to ban rock and roll music. Great album. The Train Kept a Rolling, great song. Spirit of Woodstock, the first version of Spirit of Woodstock is on this album. Later, the Sunsets and Shaky Stevens would record it for a different album. And then ending with 2 great songs of Chuck Berry. This is a great album. This is actually a fantastic listen. It's a history lesson in rock and roll music. And it's recorded so authentically. It's really, really amazing. Again, produced by the great Dave Edmunds. Got inspired by this one to record his version of I Hear You Knocking, which became a big hit. And I love Dave Edmunds and I love his version of I Hear You Knocking. And I also love Shaky's version on the Now Listen album. Now, 15 years later, they would collaborate together again on Lipstick, Powder and Pain. This album produced by Dave Edmunds. Now, great album, but not my favorite. It's like the production of this one is a little bit too slick, if you ask me. It's really polished and it's really like smoothed out, where the stuff before this was like more like raw rock and roll. So you can really, they were using a lot of pianos and synthesizers on this. And I think this is actually also a big influence of Dave Edmunds. Because Dave Edmunds in the 70s, he was recording like authentic rock and roll songs, and he was actually using techniques that he got inspired by Phil Spector. So a lot of layers in the music, and but a lot of guitars, and then he would mix them all together. And in the 80s, he started working with Jeff Lynne a lot, And he started adding these synthesizers and all these keyboards into his music as well, trying to catch up with the current trend in the 80s. And actually didn't really do very well for his career. And but I have the feeling that he is also, that influence has found its way into Shaky Stevens stuff here. So, and it's the direction in that sound that I really not like so much. I like the authentic rock and roll sound. It does not mean that it's a bad album. There are some great songs here. I have never been a fan of Lipstick, Powder and Pain. I mean, it's not a bad song. I will not necessarily skip it, but I never really liked it too much. I love the songs. I'm Leaving You. It's a great song. The Shape I'm In is a great song. Don't Knock Upon My Door, a great rock and roll song. There you can actually hear some of the old Shaky Stevens coming in. Turning Away is the standout song on this one. I love that song. I always loved it, and it's a great song. And if you watch the video clip, you can actually see also Dave Edmunds appearing in that one. As Long As I Have You, I love it, but I like the live version, which I think is the B-side of one of the songs. I think maybe Love Attack. Maybe it's on the B-side of Love Attack. So Long Baby Goodbye, he would often use that song to close his shows with. It's a nice rock and roll song, but all the instruments really are out of place on that song, and I think it would have worked better if they just kept to rock and roll, guitar, bass, drum, piano, and that kind of stuff. I love Bad Reputation. It's kind of like a nice song, but it's really different. So here on this album, you can already hear that he is playing with different musical influences. He's just leaving the rock and roll a little bit behind, starting to push forward to the second half of the 80s. And then with this one and Let's Boogie, to find out that it doesn't really work for him, and then go back to rock and roll again on a whole lot of Shaky album, where he would go back to a little more roots music. Well, here's another nice thing. This album also has the song The Shape I'm In, I already told you, and that song was actually previously also recorded in 1983 on this album by Dave Edmunds. So there's another common denominator here. Shape I'm In, Shape I'm In. So Dave Edmunds already recorded that song, and I have to say, and out of the bottom of my heart, to be totally honest, that I like Dave Edmunds' version a little better than this one. Although they are quite similar, because this is actually the album where Dave Edmunds already started, deviating a little bit from his traditional sound. And this is also the first one where you start working with Jeff Lynne on a couple of our songs. But other than that, it's nice to have different versions from different artists, because they are working together. It's nice to compare them. Anyway, it's Lipstick, Powder and Pain. It's not my most favorite Shaky Stevens albums, but it's still a nice listen. I still play it very occasionally. But it will absolutely never be a match for the early rock and roll albums, and not even for the ones that came later, like A Whole Lot of Shaky and There's Two Kind of Music, Rock and Roll. So my two least favorite Shaky Stevens albums: Let's Boogie, Lipstick, Powder and Pain, and then fantastic, A Legend. I hope you like this video. Please tell me what you think about this. Please tell me if you do or do not share my opinions on these albums, and I absolutely like to hear what your favorites and least favorites are. So let's start more discussions. And again, if you want to listen to all the original tracks that made up this album, please visit the link that I will put below, and you can listen to them on my Spotify playlist, which is just called The Legend, The Originals. Thank you for watching. I'm really looking forward to the next video. I'm not sure what I'm gonna come up with in the next video, but I promise you it's gonna be interesting again. Until then, take care. See you later.